Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today to our panel CE event. My name's Ashley. I'm the event director for Advanced Recovery Systems. I'll be on the back end of everything. So if anyone has any questions, please let me know. We also have a question and answer poll in the chat or in Zoom. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in there and we will respond after the presentation is over today. We have a couple polls throughout as well, so please feel free to participate. If you have any questions at all, I am here and we will send our evaluation link in the chat 30 minutes prior to the event ending, as well as an email after the event, just as a recap. So I will give it to Ryan Chu and he can take it from here.
All right, thank you very much, Ashley. Yes, my name is Ryan Chu. I'm just the opening act for the main event today. So I'm the Community Outreach Director with Advanced Recovery Systems. And if you're not familiar with us, we've got a network of treatment programs throughout the country. We have 10 different programs right now and a couple more locations coming soon, which is exciting. But we specialize in the treatment of primary substance abuse and co-occurring mental health. We have both adult programs, and we also have an adolescent program located in Sebring, Florida for ages 13 to 17. We work with most insurance as well. Lots of in-network contracts. We're about 90% in-network. And what I'll do is I'll put my contact information in the chat. And that way, if you don't already have a contact with our organization, feel free to reach out and we can work on some ways to work together and help a lot of people together. So appreciate you joining us and welcome to our professional education series. It'll be my pleasure to first introduce our moderator today, David Gulden. David is a dual licensed psychotherapist, certified interventionist, professional evaluator, and owner of A New Hope Recovery Services, located in Winter Park, Florida, close to me, right here in the Orlando area as well. And it's really special having someone like David close by to work on different cases together. So I appreciate you, David. Throughout his career, David has worked for multiple prominent national treatment providers, holding clinical positions such as primary therapist, program manager, family program director, and clinical director. And David trained with some of the leading experts in the intervention field and became a certified professional interventionist in 2017. David's passion for helping individuals and families in crisis due to substance abuse or other problematic behaviors of a friend or a loved one, and had the experience of being able to witness this firsthand on the cases that we worked on together. So appreciate that, David, and I will pass it over to you. Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you, Ryan, and welcome everybody. It goes both ways, and I just want to say thank you to Ashley and Ryan for helping put this together, and then certainly thank you to all the panelists who I'm going to introduce momentarily. I think I'm also somewhat of the opening act, but my hope here is to be able to shine the light on the role of the interventionist in the treatment process and the work that we do and what the audience does. And so I'm beyond grateful to have everybody's participation. And luckily, there's a part in here where it said the leading experts in the intervention field. Well, I'm lucky to have two of my trainers here today from my training way back, and that's Eric McLaughlin, who is actually going to be sitting in for Ken Seeley, who unfortunately for us had an intervention this morning coinciding at the exact same time we started. And but lucky for us, we have someone who's pretty amazing, friend of mine, great interventionist. And so I'm going to introduce him first. His name is Eric McLaughlin. He is the CEO of Intervention 911. Eric graduated from the UC School of Social Work in December of 2016. He oversees all the clinical services and has been instrumental in facilitating the implementation of evidence-based practices in interventions, treatment, and case management throughout the organization. And that is a treatment center and the services provided by Intervention 911. His specialty is working with family systems to intervene and reset the trajectory of families that have been impacted by addiction and mental health issues. Eric combines his clinical background with his long-term intervention experience to deal with clients and families who struggle to know what to do and how to build lasting life in recovery. Eric has developed the curriculum for and conducts over 10 trainings a year geared toward professionals who seek to develop skills in interventions and case management in the behavioral field. And I read him first because we don't have him on the PowerPoint, but Eric, do you want to just say hi to the audience here?
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Dave and Ryan and Ashley for having us. Thrilled to be here. And you're very fortunate you get the more attractive half of Ken and I. So
you said it. You said it. So great. Thank you, Ken. And next, I'd like to, let's see, it's probably the next slide there. We have Dr. Louise Stanger. Welcome, Dr. Louise. She is an LCSW. Among other things, is a preeminent clinical interventionist, thought leader in the behavioral health and addiction treatment industry. She has performed thousands of family interventions in the US and abroad, gives presentations around the country on various topics related to mental health and addiction, process disorders, and chronic pain, and has received prestigious awards from her fellow industry colleagues for her dedication to intervention and recovery. In addition to her work with clients and families, she is the former University of San Diego State University faculty at UC San Diego, University of San Diego, where she brought in over $5 million in grants for substance abuse and alcohol training and education. Dr. Stenger is lauded for developing the invitational intervention process, which uses CIS, the collective intervention strategies, a revolutionary way of working with professionals and support systems to invite change. Her work has been featured in Thrive Global, the Huntington Post Recovery Campus, Journal of Alcohol Studies, Recovery View, Sober Way, Sober World, and more. Her book, Falling Up, a memoir of renewal, recounts her travails growing up in a substance abuse family and forging her unique career path. She's also written this book, which I found incredibly informative, which is the Definitive Guide to Addiction Interventions. It is really great. I got a copy a couple of years ago. That's how I got to know Dr. Stenger. She's got a new book called Addiction in the Family, which I've also read and was a go-to when referring out for family systems. It really does, as it says, helps families navigate challenges, emotions, and recovery. It's on Rockridge Press, available on Amazon. Dr. Louise, had the honor of receiving many awards for her clinical excellence. She was recently named by London's DB Recovery Resources and Harvard McLean's Hospital as the 2019 Interventionist of the Year for her groundbreaking text. Dr. Louise is the 2018 Forgiveness of the Living Plus Awards in Los Angeles, and in 2018, the Peggy Albrecht Friendly House Service Award for Clinical Excellence. In 2016, Dr. Stenger received the Joseph L. Galetta Spirit of Recovery Award and the 2014 Foundation's Recovery Fan Favorite Speaker. Dr. Louise lives with her husband, John, and their two dogs, Teddy and Coco, in Marina del Rey. She has three daughters, Sydney, Holland, Felicia Alexander, and Shelby Stanger, and four grandchildren, stepsons, Robert and James. And when she's not working, you can find her with her family and getting in a good hike or swim. So Welcome, Dr. Louise. Can you
Well,
say
thank
hello
you
to
so
everybody?
much. You know, being just because I'm old, that's how that happens, you know, sort of senior, and then I can get all those. But what an honor, Ryan, to meet you. This is my first time meeting you, Ashley, and David, for your innovation in putting this on. And I'm really excited to be with Jeffrey and Eric and Caroline to meet you today and just learn from all of you. So my hat's off to you for arranging this training. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And if you hear barking in the background, that is Teddy and Coco, two doodles, and I will apologize already now.
Sounds good. So glad to have you, Dr. Louise. Okay, next up, we have one of my former trainers and a lovely person all around, Miss Caroline Smith. She is, among other things, a therapist. She holds a master's in professional counseling from Ottawa University. She's an LPC, a certified sexual addictions therapist and supervisor, and a certified multiple addictions therapist. She is EMDR trained and holds clinical expertise in the areas of trauma resolution, complex grief, relationship attachment, addiction interaction disorder, and the two most primary process addictions, food and sex. Caroline is the director of Pine Grove Addiction Services intensive workshops. Additionally, she frequently speaks at professional conferences throughout the United States and internationally. She's had the honor of providing plenary sessions during Ireland's first neuroscience and addiction conference. She is a trainer for both European and American professionals seeking board-registered interventionist credentialing, and has authored a chapter in the published book, Mending a Shattered Heart, A Guide for Partners of Sex Addicts, 2nd edition. Before joining Pine Grove in 2004, Caroline had an opportunity to work with individuals notable in the field, including Ralph and Marcus Earle, Marilyn Murray, Patrick Carnes, John Bradshaw, Claudia Black, Terrence Real, and Pia Melody. Smith's theoretical perspective has been heavily influenced by her graduate studies, examining the influence of early childhood experiences have on adult relationship attachment, cognitive scripts, affect regulation, Christian spirituality, sexual expression, and social functioning throughout the lifespan. She is a passionate force in the support of healing, hope, and sustainable recovery of one's authentic self. Welcome, Caroline.
Thank you. It is so exciting to be part of this panel today. I can't wait to see where it goes.
Absolutely. And I hope we are going to hear at some point about attachment theory and the role in family systems work. All right.
I'm ready to go on that. It's really important.
And last but certainly not least is Mr. Jeffery Merrick. Jeffery Merrick, Jeff is a criminal defense attorney and an interventionist in Los Angeles, California. He is a graduate of the University San Diego School of Law, a practicing member of the California Bar since 1990, and a former trial lawyer for a national law firm. Jeffery specializes in the defense of mental health, drug and alcohol related cases. His expertise is in care advocacy and alternative sentencing through the courts. Jeffery has over 12 years of experience in the field facilitating behavioral and mental health interventions. He has several years of in-house counsel as well as treatment and intervention planning experience for national recovery programs. Jeffery is a member of the NII, the Network of Independent Interventionists, which means he is not affiliated with nor receives any financial consideration from treatment programs or other involved professionals. This maintains the professional autonomy and ethical distance required to recommend only those treatment programs that are best suited to the client's and family's specific needs. Welcome, Jeff.
Hey, thanks for having me, David, and for putting this on. It's nice to see everyone. And I appreciate you, Ashley, and Ryan as well. It's great to hear about the program and be in good company this morning.
Great. So, well, with that, we are going to move into, I think we would like to to discuss what it is that I think my idea when I brought it to Ryan was to get some of the leaders in the field, but a diverse group of people to really shine the light or kind of demystify the role of the interventionist in the behavioral health process. So these are the things we're going to look at today, which are the contemporary models of intervention and those really important or specific features of those models, and then the clinical considerations of the intervention process, case conceptualization, and then collaborative treatment planning with other providers within the entire intervention process, which we'll define as we go along, and then to look at emerging trends, best practices, and then really how COVID's affected this process. So before we get started, I think we have a poll for the audience to determine who's out there. So I think Ashley will get us started there.
Are you guys able to see the answers on the screen?
I am not.
No, is it just a black screen?
No, I'm able to see like the questionnaire, but not the answers.
Oh, okay. I'll turn it over to the side and I can let you know. So far we have the most results, 63% are therapists and counselors, 7% are interventionists, 3% case managers, 3% students, 3% business development, 6% treatment center staff, and 16% other.
Great. All right, so moving forward, the first thing that we want to talk about, and we're going to actually start with another poll, which is we're going to look at the common models of intervention, the actual different application of the intervention process. So I do believe we have that another poll, correct, Ashley? There we go.
Yes,
so
we do.
How familiar are you with the common models of intervention?
If you cannot see, it says 59% are somewhat familiar, 22% very, and 18% not at all.
Great. All right. So that'll inform how we move forward. And thank you to the audience for your participation. When in looking at developing this panel, I wanted to get the experts who have really diverse experience. And so we'd like to start with kind of what most people would associate the term intervention with, which is most commonly thought of, in my experience, as the Johnson model or the surprise model of intervention. So I was wondering if Caroline and maybe Eric could take this for a little while and maybe highlight some of the themes or the components of the Johnson traditional surprise model of intervention.
Eric, do you want to go or do you want me to go first?
You can go first.
I love it. Okay. I call the Johnson model the family boundaries model. And this is the one I'm most familiar with. You know, it was started, well, in the 60s, there was an Episcopal priest that saw so many of his parishioners perishing from addiction. He made it his lifelong goal to really find out more about addiction. And he eventually created the Johnson model. His name is Vernon Johnson. He wrote a book called I'll Quit Tomorrow that was published in 1973. And he asked the question, basically, what made people stop drinking? And what he found out was it wasn't just one major life event. And he found that if you can get the person's system involved, the family, maybe the workplace, that it had a likelihood of being very successful. And published in the American Journal of Drugs and Alcohol Abuse, they did a comparison study with the Johnson model and 4 other intervention modalities. And this research comparison study found that those that underwent the Johnson model intervention were more likely to enter treatment. And if they entered treatment, they were more likely to stay in treatment than other models. So the components, there's basically 7 components of the Johnson model, and it's the team. There's a team that organizes this, and the interventionist really has that team, and the planning of how it will be done. It's focused on care and not shaming the person. And during the intervention, they only discuss the addiction, no other issues. One thing I love about when I ran the Women's Center here at Pine Grove, I loved it when interventionists would send me the letters that the family members created, the boundary letters. If you don't go to treatment and finish treatment, this is what we'll do to protect ourselves. And to have that in the client's file made a huge difference when they wanted to go AMA, because that's, you know, at some point when they don't have their crutch, that's a common occurrence. So the only difference, I think, variant in the Johnson model that I need to have people aware of is that if it's a sexual addiction or an intimacy disorder, that you may not have adult children, certainly minor children, parents, or the employer, unless the addiction has progressed to where it's including, you know, some violation in the workplace. So I'll leave it there for you, Eric. If you want me to join back in later, I will.
Perfect. Thank you, Caroline. I'm going to introduce, Ken has jumped on and I sent him the wrong link, so shame on me. So it says my name, but this gentleman right here is, was our panelist we had scheduled. And as Eric said, we got the better looking of the two, said, Ken. So you might want to address that while you're on here, but thank you for popping on for a second. And we're talking about the Johnson model briefly, but just glad to have your face here.
Yeah. Sorry, I couldn't jump in for the whole thing. Eric made a huge error. I'm the one that trained Eric, and I am the better looking one. So whatever Eric says today is what I helped him learn, except besides his master's program, of course. But thank you for having me. And I'm just out in Big Bear, California right now, doing an intervention. And, I messed up our times. I thought it was 6 o'clock California time, so I thought it wouldn't matter. But, I love what Caroline just said about the Johnson model, and I don't think many people really use the Johnson model, like what it was first intended to be. I think everybody has tweaked it. And so ours is really more of a family systemic and, Johnson combined, where we're bringing the family in to put those bottom lines in, like Caroline just said, of, what we're going to do to protect ourselves. That's the key component. They have been harassed and they have been held hostage in their family systems because the addict runs all over them. But now they're going to take care of themselves and they're going to do what is necessary to stop the addiction in their lives. And that puts boundaries in place for them to stop doing their drugs and alcohol. So I'm glad I caught that part with you, Caroline.
Great. Thanks for jumping in, Ken. And I'm going to pass it over to Eric also, just to maybe finish up on any elements of the Johnson model you think relevant, Eric.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks, Caroline and Ken. I think, kind of my thinking is right aligned with you guys in terms of what the Johnson model is. And, I think the crux of any intervention, despite the model, is like, why do people change, right? Like what would engage someone in the process of change? And the Johnson model takes the approach that there's an external factor, right? There's an external factor. There's the family boundaries, those kind of things. Hey, this is what we're doing as a family moving forward. And to me, that's so powerful because oftentimes people are hijacked by the mental illness or the addiction, and they don't have the insight or ability to make the choice to recover. And I think a lot of times they want to, they don't know how, and the system around them has not been given a guidebook how to deal with your loved one who is addicted, or a guidebook that says how to deal with your loved one who has a mental health issue. So the framing of the Johnson model is something that we use and carry throughout. We have a 2-day process. We work with the family first, and then the identified person is invited into that process. So the surprise terminology is accurate, but also I'm excited we're going to talk about like when to employ different models. And as Ken said, our goal, we do a lot of trainings for interventionists, and what we often say is learn every model of intervention, because you never know when you're going to need to employ one model versus another. And you're going to take things from the invitational, from the family systemic, from the Johnson, and you're going to create your model of intervention that works for your skill set. And I think the great thing about like shows like Intervention have been that people now understand that there's a way that they can do something differently. And kind of the challenge of that is that they don't really show the whole process. I think any of our panelists can speak to the fact that the process and time that goes into the intervention process is extensive. We'll spend upwards of 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 hours with a family before we even engage with the identified person, education, support, directing them on their own personal recovery. So I'm excited to hear from the other panelists about their models, because I always love to learn what can I be doing to meet the needs of the clients as they present to us. So
Absolutely. I think when I was coming along as a therapist, we had to pick a theoretical orientation, and everybody ends up going towards what was formerly eclectic, now integrative. But I mean, I think we have to be able to obtain training, but not everything's going to work for every client, every family system. And that is exactly why we wanted to really look at these different approaches or models, and really how the progression from really the original Vernon Johnson's idea and certainly model, how that's evolved to where we are today, and really provided a much more comprehensive role of the interventionist from pre-treatment to post-treatment. But to that, I think I'd like to bring in maybe Jeff and Dr. Stanger to discuss invitational intervention. Jeff, would you want to start just on the basics of invitational?
Sure. I love what was said earlier, I think by Ken, how we need to be, and Eric, in terms of being schooled really and have experience with each model, because no two interventions are alike. And I think what people need to understand is that invitational doesn't mean it's optional. It's very important to follow through with that meeting. I know I've done interventions with Dr. Louise, and we've had some that will say, okay, they're invited to join the meeting the next day, the intervention family friend meeting. And rather than go to that meeting, they would just like to go straight to treatment. And a lot of people would say, okay, that's a huge win, let's go. And while you don't have to necessarily have the full formal meeting, it's critical that you go through the boundaries and the consequences, set the intention. It's a very different meeting because you're not really wading through necessarily the layers of denial. But one thing I've learned with experience really is that you have to really keep it simple. In terms of inviting someone, the idea is to bring them into the process and help this family so that they're not confusing, especially a surprise intervention is often confused or wrapped up in a ruse. You're having brunch at Aunt Bunny's. We even had one where it was your birthday party, that shouldn't happen because you're dealing with someone who already has a lot of shame, almost always. And to empower them and empower this family, I find that we have more of a strength-based approach when we have a family that's able, after being fully prepared, to go and meet their loved one and say, hey, we're having a meeting tomorrow. We need you to join. Really, there's just 3 basic parts of an invitation so that you don't have the entire invitation or the entire intervention brought in through invitation. And this is, we want to have first off, a time frame that's very narrow, so that after the prep, before the meeting, you don't want a lot of time. You don't want to say you're invited to a meeting next week or that meeting likely won't happen. The idea would be to say, after they're fully prepped. And typically we don't want really the parent-child or the spouse dynamic that really is predominating. We want to break that up and maybe have someone who's an uncle or a friend. Usually 2 team members will go, and the 3 parts really of an invitation are: you're invited to a meeting. It's a really important meeting where we're going to talk about the problem, and that's going to be substances, typically mental health, whatever it is, just to be very clear about the problem. And then we're going to find a way forward. And this is one where parents and spouses, sometimes employers, get very vague. And it's a time when they should be more specific. So rather than say, hey, you'll find out tomorrow, and just kind of walk away, this is your opportunity to say, hey, we actually have come together and we're offering you the gift of treatment. And while it's not the only treatment program, it's the one that we can afford. It's the one that we have looked and taken a look at. And it's the offer of help that we're going to have. Often what you'll hear from a family is that they'll never come. Our experience is they almost always will come, especially an alcoholic. Alcoholic will always come when there's a meeting about them. We want to control things. I say we, I'm in personal long-term recovery. Actually, tomorrow is 15 years. And what I noticed working in treatment is that often people who present themselves for treatment are still coming with lots of stipulations, demands, conditions. This, I'm double parked, 30 days, that's it, is not going to be a successful treatment plan. And so intervention really will help set that intention, have a longer plan. And what I find too is that it gives time for the identified loved one to process, to go through that anger. The switchboards, we warn families, are going to light up. You're going to get calls. They're going to see where everyone stands. So it's a chance for the team members to say, hey, it's going to be okay, but this is where I'm at on this thing. So around the margins of this, we find a lot of interesting dynamics. As a younger lawyer, I heard the expression, have you guys heard the expression, most cases are going to settle on the courthouse steps? I thought that was like a figure of speech until I was almost literally doing that. Because there's something about going in front of a judge or jury where all the BS sort of has to subside and your real bottom line has to be decided. And I think there's something really beautiful that happens when there is the pressure of a meeting in a few hours or tomorrow. They also are able to walk into that meeting knowing that there won't be a surprise, there won't be a ruse. They also can be told, hey, it's not mandatory. You'll have options, but they're not very good options. And we're going to talk about that too, and how we're going to take care of ourselves.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. I think you made a lot of great points on how we, when families approach the intervention process, they have a lot of ideas on what's going to happen or what's not going to happen. I mean, invariably, when I work with families, there's always one or more people that say he or she's not going to go, like this is a waste of time. And so we work through that, or we're going to have a meeting. We're going to have maybe 5 meetings every Monday to talk about this problem. And they're never going to come to this invitation. And typically people come. So I think what I certainly the common theme I know about all these models is planning. And that's a lot of the intensive heavy lifting work that interventionists do. And just to kind of shift to Dr. Louise to maybe expand on invitational and the family systemic model, and certainly her own developed model of, I'll let her tell you.
Well, first of all, I'm going to be controversial. There is no model. All of these are processes. Why do I say that? Because outside of Miller and Rolnick, who did research in prisons and motivational interviewing and in ER rooms, there really has not been any research like NIH, NIAAA grants on interventions, because we do them alone or we do them with a team. So these are processes and they're really beautiful. And, you know, well, Carolyn, I love that you paid homage to Vern Johnson. I learned how to do interventions from his best friend. And his best friend was a guy by the name of Dr. Frank Picard. And Dr. Frank Picard, at the time, my job was to develop the first graduate substance abuse course in the country, when the law said that MFTs, social workers, etc., had to have a graduate course in alcohol and other drugs. And Mr. Burkhardt came in and he wrote a book called Family Intervention. And I just want to pay homage to him because he was at that time, he was the director of Springbrook, which was not owned by Hazleton. And he said, look, well, when he spoke, my heart stopped because he described my family. And I was always really good with trauma. I was always good with moving people to change. Like I had worked in an ER. And that's really where I got my first training. And the process was surprised, but I was short, I was little, and I was young. And I didn't feel really comfortable about doing interventions alone. So right away, I always thought that number one, I needed to team with someone else. And I have kept that to myself, always teaming with another person. 97% of all the people I team with, I represent family. And I do argue that about 97% of the work up front is with family, because family unconsciously aligns. And when you get a phone call, you know that someone is exasperated. They've nagged, pleaded, begged, still yelled, shot, but there is some unconscious benefit to keeping the system as it is. So in the beginning, my team and we spend maybe 20, 30 hours up front learning about the family, and I have my own process, which is family mapping using a research methodology called portraiture. It's really simple. You all do it. So it's just the way that I devised it. And that's, tell me something special about yourself. Tell me why your heart is hurting. Tell me what your fears are, what the objections are, and tell me what your hopes are. And from the get-go, as Jeff said, it's okay for a family to say to the identified loved one, and we do call it the ILO, hey, you know what, there's a family problem and we're going to find a family solution. And we've started working with X. We don't tell them our last names or anything, but that we're going to be straight up. That being said, when we talk about family systemic, our goal is not just to get the identified loved one into treatment, but it's also to set the stage for changing the entire family in a solution-focused way. So CIS just means, and everybody does this in their own way, you always, no matter how many degrees or how many letters you have against your name, in 7 seconds, the panel or the people watching decided if they like to or not, or they like the sound of our voice, or they are willing to trust all of us. And so we're going to violate whatever process we say we do anyhow. But we try very much to create a system in which, we also acknowledge the family. So sometimes there might be a family member who also needs treatment or might have an alcohol or other drug problem. And, we have to coach them to say, hey, today it's not about us. Or it may be that we can't do the intervention on the identified loved one till that one goes to treatment, or we may have to invite someone to leave. In any event, we're always looking for that outlier, that person that everybody says it's not really important to the family, because we're looking for those people that are most important. And what it is, it's collective, and that we look to create a team, and we create that team with naval families or with business managers, estate attorneys, whatever, co-workers, to create change. It's intervention or invitational because we seek to motivate change. And we do that in a way without shame or blame, but with love and compassion. And the strategies we use are based on, our own skills in terms of honoring each one of those people. And it's independent in the respect that, as Jeffrey put on his resume, we're not related to any treatment center in the country. And even though X treatment center may give us a referral, if it's not the right referral, we have an obligation to say that. So being independent means we give 3 treatment centers that based on what the retrospective biopsychosocial is, meaning what do we learn, what the family can afford, and what would be the best treatment center. As Carolyn suggested, if someone has a sex addiction, you're not going to send them somewhere that doesn't specialize in that. Or if someone is 85 or 72, you're not going to send them with a bunch of 17-year-olds. It's just not going to work. So matching, or they have chronic pain or mental health, you're going to try and match it. So I'm just so excited to be with all of you. And because I think that each one of us brings it. And I don't know anyone in the group that hasn't said they're doing an invitation that hasn't been surprised. Because the family forgot to give the invitation.
I bet. I can only imagine. I didn't think you were very controversial on the model versus process, and but I absolutely understand. I really came upon your book when I was trying to do a simple kind of overview of what I was basically calling theory, which it wasn't, meaning Johnson versus, and to that end, I really would say that Dr. Stenger's textbook on interventions and the definitive guide really is what I found to be a great overview of most of what we're talking about in this regard, and then a lot of great information on her own process of the collective intervention strategy. And just briefly, I want to mention, unfortunately, I tried very hard to get Gene Campbell or Dr. Jim Tracy or Bill Maher, who developed an additional process or model of intervention called the action model. I just want to briefly describe it, really because I thought it was so cool. As a therapist, I've always been drawn to elements of experiential therapy. I've been really lucky to work with some awesome, amazing experiential therapists who were informed by Jacob Moreno and psychodrama, which quick side note about my history: when I was deciding to either go become an interventionist, or the other thing I was really looking to do was get extensive training in psychodrama, and I chose the latter, and I'm glad, but my heart is with psychodrama. And I just wanted to briefly state this, and when we send some things out to the attendees, I'll send some specific information to this model. But the action model is an intervention model that combines elements of the family systemic and invitational models, and then experiential work informed by sociometry and psychodrama, sociometry being the underlying theory of psychodrama. And that this model was awarded the Innovators Award by the American Society of Group Psychotherapy and Psychodrama in 2016. Super cool. A lot of really experiential work with the family system throughout the invitational process, and very cool. And I happened to stumble upon it in Dr. Stenger's book. So thank you for that as well.
Yeah, there are some fun things, like, and sometimes I bet all of us use it. Like, you might have placards, happy, sad, mad, whatever, and you throw them across the floor. Or there's a wonderful video, which people might like. It's actually learning how to ride a bicycle backwards. And when you show it to families, these are just really little things. They go, wait a minute, how did you learn how to ride this bicycle backwards and everything? It's really like, that's a way of breaking into sort of, oh, this is what we're trying to learn. We're trying to learn how to meet family in a totally different way, because the responses we've been giving haven't been working. So it juggles the brain a little bit, but really some cool things that anybody doing any intervention can use.
Well, I've run many hours of group therapy, and I'm sure there's some group therapists on in the audience, and I found that anything you do to get people to move around and access different parts of their brain, the better. And so combining what is certainly a high stress, high anxiety situation with a family system working on this problem in the intervention and process, I like the idea of kind of, taking down some of those barriers and really working through, what I find to be a really effective means of trauma therapy and all types of conditions or issues to be worked through experiential therapy. So again, thank you for that. And I think we want to move on to when we're looking at an invitational or integrative or Johnson model or what have you, how you as interventionists approach each family system or the identified patient or loved one, and kind of the considerations clinically that you take into how you work with that person and that family. So I was wondering, Eric, can you talk to us a little bit about, how you might determine one model over the other, and if you were going to pick, what's something that would definitely indicate we're going to do a surprise intervention here because blank?
Yeah, and I think safety is always kind of like my first concern in terms of process, and I appreciate how Jeff was able to address, some of the family concerns too that come up, which is the belief that, if we tell him, he'll run. If we tell them, they won't show up. But that's a consideration that I always take into effect. And a lot of times I empower the families to make the decision. What we'll do is we'll take a look at what are the options. Hey, he's in the hospital. He may be discharged. We might not have time to be able to coordinate a full invitational style. Would we want to be able to meet him in the hospital to take advantage of where he's at physically? So I look at safety, I look at type of presentation. I certainly, when we talk about a surprise model, I'm with the panel that I don't think deception is a good ruse to get people to a place. And certainly I don't think that someone who has a significant trauma history or may, as you've evaluated, find they have PTSD, knocking on their door at 8 a.m. and going surprise may not be advantageous to either the process or their ability to recover. So I do like to take into effect kind of who the person is that we're intervening on, what the family experience is with, do they have the tools? Are they capable of communicating in an effective way? I'm working with a family right now, and we're at basically an invitational style intervention because the family just isn't able to, they don't want to cross their parent. They don't want to work behind the scenes on their parent. So acknowledging that within the family system and recognizing that. And I've had the reverse be true too, where families say, I absolutely positively cannot tell him, and sometimes it's the concern that I feel like he's going to go out for one last hurrah. So balancing kind of the pluses and minuses, the advantages and the disadvantages, and empowering the family to be able to have a say in what the process we use moving forward is really something I look to as well.
Absolutely. And I think to that end, certainly timing is always an issue. I think a lot of us, if we get calls where people are in crisis and it's a life or death situation, as I conceptualize it often, and it's scary, right, to think of that last hurrah or time. But then there is that other end of it, that people don't like to be surprised. They don't like to like to lie to their loved ones. And so finding that mix of risk versus reward, I think we're all pretty, experienced in that. And like I say to families sometimes, well, we're going to pay our money and take our choice here, but I also have had that experience where we start off with one idea, like we're going to do this surprise intervention because of timing and the severity of use. And then it really just evolves one way into something that's more invitational or soft intervention, and because it has to. So I absolutely understand. And anything to add on that, Caroline, just on the model? Or
yeah, I just really never think dishonesty is part of mental health progression, so I agree. Lying to a client to get them to an intervention sets it up for failure.
Yeah. And so maybe we could kind of move and parlay that onto kind of the same question, determining factors for an invitational versus surprise, or maybe different ways to invite the loved one in to Jeff and Dr. Stanger. Jeff, just kind of thoughts on that, or how you make those determinations?
I just think that the key is just to be fluid and realize that you're focusing on a family that's in great trauma and pain as well. And so to support them and come from a position, you know, I love Brad Reedy's book, Journey of the Heroic Parent. And I try to really teach a family that this is a courageous act, not without fear. Like any heroic journey, you will be tested. And by the time we're talking, they've sort of had this secondary injury in terms of going to helping professionals, being called a caretaker, an enabler. You know, of course, we have to look at the codependency, and we have to look at the ways that they've been hijacked. But I think we also have to keep in mind that they've been traumatized as well. So to bring their comfort level down and also let them know it's going to be okay. They're going to be able to walk through this, and that to do battle is a very courageous act with this adversary.
Absolutely great analogy there insofar as battle, and certainly the power of the disease versus the power of the family, and trying to empower that family system to address this problem. I think that's what we all want to do and try to do. And Dr. Louise, your thoughts on that insofar as determinations clinically?
So I love what Eric said, and obviously also what Carolyn and Jeffrey said. You know, I always give families no fault insurance. They did the best they could do with the resources they have, and now maybe we're going to try something different. As far as clinical considerations, I'm just thinking about this year more than ever. I have done more, we've had more families in direct crisis, and Eric mentioned that slightly. The rise of substance-induced psychosis with young adults from sativa, which is 97% THC, has really required that, you know, we need to be really fluid in terms of how we do our therapeutic interventions, because a lot of them are doing, you know, working with hospital social workers, working with the mental health facility, because that is where the invitation to change takes place. And that's a whole different kind of level. So I think the clinical considerations are: who are your client? Who is the family? What are their determining factors? What are they willing to do? And then, you know, taking a look. So I think that, you know, everyone on this panel is very probably fluid and flexible, because we have to be able to move. I often think like we're in many respects like ER. I was trained as an ER social worker. So we're doing a lot of crisis and really being mindful of the trauma that people have and the courage they have. I never use, I never use the terms addict or alcoholic. I say people experience substance use disorder, mental health disorder, anxiety, depression, chronic pain. And I try and honor that family system, because they did the best that they could do, even though we know that that wasn't what we would have liked to have seen, but we know that from our own experience to help move them to change.
Absolutely. It's such a great point. I mean, I think when I came into just the basic understanding of intervention, I really wasn't looking at it through a systems lens. And I was in graduate school in a family couples and a family LMFT program. And so to that degree, to really look at the fact that this is a common problem and disease, or however you want to look at it, but it really does affect everybody, and everybody's been a part of that problem. Therefore, the solution, lends itself to the same process, that everybody is going to be hurting, and I think needs their own recovery, their own work, and so on and so forth, which can be a harder sell, as we know. I mean, sometimes whether you're just a family therapist, an interventionist, often the family system has their own barriers to getting help that will really affect systemic change in that system, which is what I tell every family I work with. Like, that's the goal. We want to get your mom to treatment or the help that your dad needs or what have you, but really to get a system that's healthier, that's not going to support the disease or the disorder or the behavior. So I think to that degree, looking at some theoretical underpinnings that you work with in this process, and maybe we could start with you, Dr. Stenger, just on when you're looking at, I'm a structural family therapist. If I had to say, that's the one thing that I employ with interventions. but I'm existential as it goes in my work as an individual therapist or core theoretical. But to the therapists out there, when you're working with families throughout the whole process, what are the theoretical interventions or themes that you use in your work?
Oh, golly, that's a big question. So let me try. So, when someone calls us up and they engage, our paperwork is easy for 60 or 90 days. That doesn't mean that the intervention takes that long. But I start out by interviewing everybody individually and using a research methodology called portraiture, which was developed by Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot out of Harvard, which I used in other research studies. And really, I start out by trying to get what's called triangulation of data. Hold on a minute, and I'll show you the ravings of a mad woman. And I'm pretty infamous for what's called family mapping. So I'm not going to show you. This is a family map, right? I don't know whose this is, but what I try and do is map out with brightly colored pens, all 18 of them, which are sort of sitting here, and butcher block table about the identified loved one. At the same time, I'm doing a rapid biopsychosocial, and I'm not using it's not your ordinary genogram. That's all I can say. And I do trainings on it because I want to learn about the traumas that happen, the intergenerational change, who I put wings on bailers, outers, and everything, and see that, because that will help me navigate who I'm going to work with, who might be a problem, and everything. At the same time, we're clicking off in our heads, and my teammates will do some of the interviews too. You get what you call saturation of data. And at the same time, you're clicking off what would be the best treatment center. At the same time, you're trying to figure out in a solution focus. So I guess if you said, what are the theoretical underpinnings? Solution focused, because we want to have action oriented. We want to be problem solving. What is it that we need to do? Who do we need to have help? And introduce, as Jeffrey said, the impact letter, which becomes and Carolyn mentioned that becomes very important. Ed Storty will talk about it as being a living eulogy. We'll talk about it as being heart, hurt, and hope. What's special about that individual, what's really, what are the memories you can elicit because you're so angry right now? Do you remember the day they were born? Do you remember when you went fishing? Do you remember something to move their heart to break into the honeycomb of the denial? What are the eyewitness accounts that you're experiencing today, or you experienced in the last 4 to 6 months, that are causing your heart to hurt? The car was wrapped around, they lied, they cheated, they ended up with multiple DUIs or being arrested for being exposed in public, whatever it is. What are those eyewitness accounts? And then what is your hope? Your hope is obviously you're going to accept treatment. So when you talk about therapeutic interventions, there's probably about 90 different ones of them, except that you've got to use yourself. And so motivational interviewing, solution focus, ACT, meditation, and mindfulness, because you want to be mindful. But I think, again, the key for me is doing the family map and creating a portrait, and then getting everybody's buy-in, because they're really excited because you spend so much time talking to them alone and really making them part of the solution.
Great, fantastic. And I love how you've kind of adapted like the concepts of Bowenian therapy or the genogram to really work for you. I mean, that's awesome. I see Caroline smiling and shaking her head, so maybe we go that direction and your process or kind of how your own therapeutic intervention, your trainings inform your work with families.
I'm smiling because I agree so much with everything Dr. Stanger just said. So I think it's important to see the identified patient as the family. Jack Erdman, in his book, Whiskey's Children, said, home is the wound that never heals. Well, I disagree with that. I think it can heal if you understand sort of the etiology of the suffering. And attachment theory is brilliant. There's 3 basic styles. And I tell my clients, we do all 3. Our goal is to be in secure attachment. And what we teach is adult achieve secure attachment. It's been said that addiction is the ultimate attachment disorder. So there's insecure, anxious attachment, insecure avoidant attachment, and then secure attachment. And there's a lot of very interesting information that ties to those different primary attachment styles. For instance, someone with insecure anxious is going to be hyper needy in a relationship. They often feel less valuable than others. They have very difficult time setting boundaries because they don't want to upset anyone or be rejected by anyone. And they're flooded emotionally. And this group of individuals with this primary attachment style often use central nervous system depressant drugs and behaviors. They want to numb out. On the flip side, people with a primary attachment style of avoidance often see themselves in a very grandiose way. They're better than, they deserve the best. They're walled off versus boundaries. They use walls to protect the wound. And this is where I see so many of my sex addiction clients in this avoidant attachment. And then they try to be perfect. No one is perfect, but they have this facade of looking good, but it's very lonely in that place. So a lot of times, family systems that are struggling with this disease have learned generationally a lack of differentiation. Codependency isn't a clinical term. I've tried to spiff it up a little bit. I call it pathological altruism or sick giving. But it's basically two ticks and no dog. I mean, we're trying to get the needs met by others. We're projecting our needs onto someone else. We're not being responsible for self because primarily we don't know ourselves. Insecure attachment is sort of a lack of opportunity to really develop and to feel secure internally, secure enough to risk adventure. I ask clients, can you remember who you were before you were told who you had to be? I love this quote by Dr. Ellis Miller. She said, "The truth about our childhood is stored up in our body. Although we can repress it, we can never alter that truth. Our intellect can be deceived, our feelings manipulated, our conceptions confused, and our bodies tricked with medication. But someday the body will present its bill, for it's as incorruptible as a child who still whole in spirit will accept no compromises or excuses until we stop avoiding the truth." So one of the most important assessments is the 10-question adverse childhood experiences assessment, because our attachment style develops very early in our childhood. And there, what the ACE findings show, it's fascinating. There's a stronger link between childhood adversity and addiction than there is between obesity and diabetes. So feeling safe is our midbrain, the limbic system is where we house all of our feelings. And if we're a small child and we don't feel safe and accepted, then there's a whole neurobiology process that impacts learning, that impacts behavior, that certainly impacts our well-being. In fact, people with 6 or more ACEs are going to die 20 years earlier on an average. People with 4 ACEs have double the risk of heart disease, lung cancer, and 4 ACEs increases the likelihood of becoming an alcoholic by 700%. So, I mean, these findings, this was normed on a group of over 17,000 people in San Diego. I call it the biggest study, biggest story never told. It was started by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente. A couple other things on the ACE findings. If you have a score of 4 or more, you're over 1,500% times more likely to attempt suicide. So looking at the adversity in childhood, and I agree so much with Dr. Stanger, parents do the very best they can. And no parent can ever give a child secure attachment if they don't have the secure attachment themselves. So I like what ASAM, how they define addiction. It's a stress-induced, genetically mediated, primary chronic relapsing brain disease of reward and memory and related brain neurocircuitry. Dr. Daniel Shumrock, who's done so much to advance understanding addiction as a disease, says, addiction is a ritualized, compulsive, comfort-seeking behavior. It's a normal response to unresolved childhood adversity, just as bleeding is a normal response to being stabbed. So it's an adaptation. And I really believe that everyone in the family system is going to feel distress, and it gets acted out and manifest in many different ways. And so I think the family has to be the identified patient.
Couldn't agree with you more, I think. And certainly having, for the therapist or anybody working with substance use disorder clients or mental health or what have you, that trauma, big T trauma, little t trauma, however you want to look at it, is such a component, and certainly lends itself to self-medication or different forms of maladaptive coping. And so if you were going to give advice out to an interventionist working with a family system, and I love it that the identified patient is the family, is the system itself, which I think you're preaching to the choir for a lot of us on that one. How might you suggest using scales like the ACE, or would you be building a picture of this family system or the identified patient in relation to potential attachment issues or disorder?
I work real closely with Ken and Eric, and oftentimes I work with the family, after the patient has gone to treatment, the identified person with the addiction. And it's interesting if the family doesn't do their work. It's like you take this is a Southworth quote, you take the patient out of the leprosy colony, you put them in the hospital, they get cured of leprosy, and then you send them back to the leprosy colony and say, don't get sick again. So Ken and Eric have developed, and I don't get paid for saying this, but I know that they've developed a system where the whole family has assessment, and it's that small window where the family says, we'll do anything. And so in that window, you say, if you really mean this, then this is what you're going to do. And there's assessment and support, really powerful support, 12 different areas of support for the family that they engage in. Because what a wonderful thing for the person that goes to treatment to know that their family member is addressing their own issues, and that, they're not the sick one that needs to get fixed. That's a really wonderful, powerful, healing environment. Absolutely.
And I think often we all find that there's trauma throughout the system, so you might see, I had a friend of mine who's a clinician who used to say water seeks its own level working with couples. If you had one impaired person who was the glaring, pathological behaviors, that there's another part to that. And so, but I think to that end, having compassion for everybody involved, but also I think holding the system accountable to their own work. I was working on an invitational intervention, and everybody was worried the person we were trying to bring in wouldn't go to treatment, wouldn't work on anything. And the simple solution was, well, y'all are, you're working on it yourselves. And
right.
That's what you say to them, like, we're going to recover with or without you, was the message that really brought the person in and incentivized them, because it's what needed to happen, but it certainly was a motivator in that regard.
It reduces their shame.
Absolutely.
Oftentimes I think that that person that has the active addiction might be the healthiest person in the family. When I ran the Women's Center, therapists would say, I think we'd have more success if the family came into treatment and this person came for Family Week.
Absolutely. And I think, did somebody want to say something?
Yeah, I would say, Carolyn, I love the model that or the processes that you and Eric use. I mean, I do the same thing, although in terms of my paperwork, I no longer work with anybody who doesn't want to work. So in terms of family, but we offer solution-focused family recovery, and we call it coaching, because in my experience, and maybe not yours, families don't like the word therapy.
No, they don't.
They don't want to be therapized, but the way in, at least I found, is like, and you know, we're all doing the same thing with a little variation on the theme, because you have to do what's best for you. Is through the family mapping, and then getting them, you know, instead of wanting to learn about how Joey or Sally is doing, or Martha or George is doing in treatment, it's like, so what are you doing to take care of yourself? And then providing that psychoeducation for them, because to me, you know, if we don't work to change whatever that family system is, whether it's the manager of the rock band, or it's the mother tearing her hair out and the dad that's unavailable, we really are not going to be able to effectuate change at all for that identified loved one, with the exception of not sending them back home. And with the increase right now in adolescent work, the increase in teen suicide, the increase in teen mental health, the increase in teen substance abuse, this becomes even just so much more that we have to deal with on the get-go, because the research or the statistics are showing 8-year-olds are acting out right now, 10-year-olds. That's not my wheelhouse, so I'm not saying that is, but in terms of family work, we must include that.
It's such a great point, as any therapist who's worked with someone, you know, later in life, to see that childhood trauma and the progression, and certainly I think factoring in that is essential. And I'm so glad to hear these different ways that we approach it, and really really looking at holistically to affect change. It's fantastic. I will run us out of time, because I'll just like get into this conversation, and if I don't drive the train. So I want to move on to case conceptualization. Before we do that, I believe we have a poll just to kind of get an idea of how comfortable anyone would be in the audience on when to bring in an interventionist. Like, and so I think if Ashley can put that poll up. So how confident are you in your ability to determine if an intervention is needed when working with individuals and families, and just to rank kind of where you fit on there?
For this poll, we have a few, 4% are least likely, and then from 3 down to 10 were the rest of the attendees. 32% were 7 out of 10, and then 15% were 8, 7 were 9, and 7 were most confident.
Great, awesome, thank you. So let's start with when we're all looking at a family that comes to us at the first call, or and we're building that picture of this is the case. It's the family, it's the identified patient, and we all have different, you know, elements of our processes. But maybe we could just speak to, like, maybe Eric could take this one, starting off, like how you've learned to be the most effective assessment, and what are you looking for in the preliminary stages of working with a family?
Yeah, and Dave, I wish we had an extra hour. I'd love to touch base on some of what Caroline and Dr. Louise were talking about, because it is so, it's like a meat and potatoes kind of issue. There's a lot there. Although I am kind of glad because I was writing on my list of evidence-based approaches that I use, and they nailed them all. So I was like feeling a little anxious about not having something new to say. You know, I think that anytime a family reaches out to an interventionist, that's like almost a surefire sign that an interventionist is needed. Because typically, in my experience, what I find is that families only go to that when they feel like they've done everything else. Oftentimes they feel like they've done everything else, and they feel a lack of ability to manage or rectify the situation on their own. And I think, you know, thinking more broadly, because I think for interventionists, if we're getting the call, like I said, that's the assessment right there. They need help. But when we talk about admission staff, when we talk about therapists, when we talk about psychiatrists, when we talk about medical professionals, I think that we have to keep an open mind that like treatment is really, really, really important, right? Like I would say that people getting help and going to treatment is really important. But to echo kind of, I think what we're talking about when we talk about the family systems approach, what's even more important is helping people understand what recovery looks like. And I'm not talking about sobriety. I'm talking about what does long-term recovery look like, wellness for the entire system. And families are completely incapable of identifying, implementing, and maintaining those things without support. So I think from a professional standpoint, we as interventionists have done a little bit of a disservice in terms of honing our focus on getting someone to treatment. Because I think that's what people think interventionists do. And kind of in our trainings, and as a professional speaker and as someone who's had a lot of experience in this, what I look to is how do we foster education around a long-term approach, the right intensity of treatment at the right time for the right duration. And how do we get the whole family into recovery? And so I think that the question has to be, is the family capable of supporting recovery? Not are they capable of getting their loved one to treatment? Because I often joke sometimes with families that a monkey could get someone to treatment. Getting them to treatment isn't really the be all and end all. It's the start of the process, but really the education and the long-term commitment to a plan of accountability for recovery for the entire family system is what's key. And if you have someone presenting that's demonstrating, we don't know what to do, we've tried everything, I feel like I enable, I can't get my loved one to stop using, I just don't know what to do, we don't know if this is really a problem, he's experimenting, he's had a few DUIs. For an intervention, you don't have to wait until, when a car is driving and your oil light goes off, you might say, okay, the oil light's off, I'm getting low on oil, maybe I'll go in. And then the windshield wiper fluid light goes off, and then the brake light goes off. And a lot of times people wait until the car is like smoking and the engine stops and seizes on the highway. That's what families do with addiction because they just don't know. They don't have enough information. So when they call that first time and say, you know what, my loved one has some mental health issues and they've started using pot and I've noticed an increase in paranoia, I'm not really sure what to do. Bring in, it doesn't have to be an interventionist, bring in someone to support the family in the recovery process. And I find that through open, honest, and direct communication in a family system, you can start to tease these things out. You can start to show where the behavior may have originated, what Caroline was saying about the etiology, what Dr. Stanger was saying about that kind of family mapping. And then you can address what are the supports that are needed to improve family functioning. And so the last thing I'll say is, when families come to us, there's like, if you picture yourself back at 6 months old in your crib, smiling and googly at the mobile above you, right? And the mobile has a triangle and a square and a circle and a trapezoid and all these different shapes. And it's just kind of hanging in there in balance. And what happens with families is they seek balance around the addiction. So when we pull out a piece of that, the family is unstable. And that's the moment where Caroline's saying they're ready to work. They're ready to do whatever it takes. But when that piece comes back in, the family is almost always going to try to revert back to the previous balance, but we have to show them a new balance. So if in your assessment, when you're working with someone, you're seeing that the family has difficulty in doing recovery-oriented behavior, then bring in an interventionist, bring in a long-term support to be able to help them.
Great answer. And I think, as we know, when we send, when someone goes to treatment, we think that the discharge planning should start day one, because we want to make sure there's no gaps in the process and so on and so forth. So assessment being key to that process. And certainly with interventionists, we all have our style and model, and it's great to hear about these targeted ways that we build a picture or conceptualize a case. But I guess in some of the more simple terms or simple processes, maybe Jeff or Dr. Stenger, and I love your comment, Dr. Stenger, about working with people who want to work. but when you're looking at building, you know, a team or the group, and I know that might tie in my case. A lot of times I look at safety concerns, because sometimes I will have a family system and I talk to everybody individually to make sure who can be in the room and can they follow directions or can they stay on task, or are there reasons that, you know, there's a lot of different reasons that you need to be very careful, meticulous, and vet anybody that's going to be involved based on family systems theory and the history of this family. So I wonder if you could speak to that, like how you deal with the team or the group, or how you conceptualize that in the process.
So I don't know, I'll go first, and then Jeff will have a spectacular response. But you know, what you're trying to do is create a positive crisis for the entire family, and you're going to do it from a strength-based perspective. And in the beginning, I sort of think you're a little bit like Sherlock Holmes. You're looking for those people that are really, really important to the identified loved one. Those may or may not be the ones that the family always tells you to talk about, you know, and you're looking for who really has meaning for that person. I remember a long time ago, we were doing one, and then someone said, you really can't talk to this sister-in-law. She is just not important. She actually was the one that could move the person to change. Mm-hmm. At the same time, when you're forming an intervention team, don't be afraid to disinvite someone. You don't want a saboteur. About 2 weeks ago, we did not have, I did not have with a teammate, a mother come. She absolutely had a very tenuous relationship with her 55-year-old son. She was very, I guess, narcissistic, borderline, I don't know what you want to say, but she would have she practically sabotaged the pre-intervention meeting, but we invited her not to come because she was so anxious, and that worked out to everybody's advantage. But, you know, when you're forming an intervention team, who can help move, and who can help, who do you need to sort of get out of the way, or you need to coach? And obviously, when you're doing interventions, you've got to coach people on what do they say, what do we mean, and how do we write? So make no mistake, that's where the talent of Eric, where Caroline, or Jeffrey comes really in, or anyone that we work with, because it's not a free-floating conversation. That doesn't mean that it's always in a circle, that some of the best interventions I've ever seen or I've ever been a part of, you know, you're going off and you're doing what any good lawyer does, a sidebar. You're not in a group, one of us, and that's why I like a team, because one of us can stay and deal with whatever that group is, while you have diffusers, other people, and you can go off and you can invite the person to change without this other sort of group.
Great point. I think as an interventionist, we need to be flexible, open, and I always tell families it's like doing improv comedy sometimes, if you've ever been to like an improv show. So you need to be comfortable with how everything can change, or group therapists will all relate to that, and being able to manage and be flexible and malleable. And maybe Jeff, to add on to that, and maybe if you're looking at a plan of building a case, how are you picking a treatment center, or what are some safety considerations, particular that you want to make sure that these are that everybody's safe one way or the other?
Yeah, I love what you said, Dr. Louise, about the Sherlock Holmes aspect, because we often have families that are convinced someone is not going to be an appropriate match. I like to just tell people no one's going to be on the cutting room floor. If they're super hesitant, a lot of our job is to motivate that team member so that they can actually, for themselves, decide whether they want to join the meeting the next day. Often we're having people come that we've sort of had a feeling as the interventionist that they're not going to be able to contribute in a way that's going to be helpful. Sometimes we'll ask them to write a letter. And I just try to explain too that we're just trying to get a person representing certain domains of the loved one's life. We're not able to have everyone. I had one up in Northern California a couple of weeks ago where someone had sort of a surrogate uncle role with the young man we were intervening on. His wife, however, was super triggering for this young man. They had fought before. She was sort of someone who had a contentious relationship. The prep meeting turns out it's at their home, so you have to be really diplomatic. It doesn't really have to be in terms of disinviting them, but saying, actually, we just want to have, rather than you as a couple, we're just going to pick George, let's say. But I'd love to have a letter from you, and I'd love to have your insight, because these people, you have to give them, a chance to be heard. But as Dr. Louise said too, not everyone who needs to be heard at your intervention, or is able to really manage their own emotions that are coming up. Sometimes too, there's someone who make a great share, they can, but they're silent because of whatever the bond is, codependently speaking, that prevents them from having their voice. They're not there yet, and that's okay too, especially someone who's sitting in trauma. Sometimes the person you feel is going to actually be really angry they're not invited is so relieved, because they don't want to, because they're feeling like they're going to lose that relationship. And, at the end of the day, it's going to be for them to decide whether they're going to march forward with that. This sort of dovetails with, our assessment has to have a program that has strong family work, every bit as much as it's going to have the issues that bring the person to treatment. Every website sort of promises that, but you have to know that it's got to be more than just a weekend, or we're going to give you referrals to Al-Anon or Codependency Anonymous, whatever it is, so it's a little bit like trauma informed. Trauma informed, sort of a word you hear a lot, and it's like, okay, so they've had a training, but do you really have people who are going to do the deeper work of trauma work with the person? And are they, well trained and know that you just don't jump in, I don't know, as soon as someone is detoxed or something, till they have the recovery skills they need so that they can withstand that. And then one we can sort of come around, maybe if we have time, and talk about is, clients who have legal issues, because those often get separated and compartmentalized, and the attention of a whole family can be directed towards bailing Junior out from jail at a time when, we can be talking about a release to treatment, but and also sometimes the best laid plans for intervention can fall apart when you take someone from one state to another, knowing, yes, they need the treatment, but we've had clients that actually, you get a call that they violated their probation. Probation's not good with having jurisdiction taken away any more than a court is. I've even had a client who had to do some time because they didn't care that they were going to XYZ Center in Philadelphia. They were in Arizona. Turned out to be that kind of crazy jurisdiction with Arpaio, whatever his name is, with everyone goes to jail. And that's a probation violation. So actually, you have to really be mindful. You don't have to be a lawyer, but you need to consult with the lawyer, or at least know what those parameters are, because in a perfect world, pretty much every time I can think of, the best treatment is elsewhere, and yet jurisdictionally, he's not leaving the county without a real problem. So
I think it's a good point, and I do think we'll have some time at the end to touch on your passion with alternative sentencing and the role of the legal system. And I was thinking to Ashley, maybe we could move to the next slide, because with best practices, certainly we all agree that working with the family system we've established is it's essential. Like we're not here to do an intervention to just get this person into treatment. That we know, we're often told, or we tell families, it's a family disease. And I think we all agree that the work is going to be throughout the whole family system for the best possible outcomes. And so I think we can touch on that a little bit, on how we do that. And to that end, when we look at working with a family, with a person who maybe on the front end of the intervention, who doesn't know that people are contacting us, or so on and so forth, and how confidentiality and HIPAA play in, and there's some interesting things particular to intervention work. But I guess if you're looking at if there's someone in the audience who is a therapist or whomever works with and wants to become an interventionist, or just other professionals, what are some considerations around ethics that, you would want to make sure everybody understands? Maybe Eric, just top of your head, some things to consider in the intervention process?
Yeah, I mean, the two big ones that we kind of hammer time and time again are, scope of practice as an interventionist. So if you don't have experience working with someone with an eating disorder, don't intervene on someone with an eating disorder. I think that is kind of a great baseline to go by. I think as an industry, we're an unregulated bunch, even though there are some groups that have helped with regulation and certification and training. But generally, we're an unregulated bunch. So I think we're ripe for a lot of unethical behavior. And then the second one is don't accept money for referrals. I think it's surprising how common that still is, even with all of the kind of attention to that practice from a treatment perspective. And I've had people offer me money. I've had people ask me, what do you expect? That's kind of like a key indicator for me. Maybe this isn't someone, well, it's two things. One, maybe this person is a little uneducated in the ways of ethics. And that's why having some training on ethics and knowledge is important. So I can take a mentorship role in that, or it's indicative that, that's kind of a person I wouldn't want to refer to in that. And kind of just, the other thing is that, part of being an interventionist is being part of a treatment team. An ethical way to work in a treatment team is for collaboration, not dictation. And I think that goes both ways. So as an interventionist and as a case manager, I don't want to demand the way in which things go. But one thing I've seen that's sometimes difficult for interventionists, who oftentimes are the first point of contact for families and the person that they trust, is you have to develop a network and relationship with treatment centers that are ethical. So you know that you're not going to have an issue. Nothing's worse than referring to someplace and then the family coming back and saying, this is really weird. They don't have any medical staff on site. So you have an obligation to work with people, but also the flip side is true. You want treatment centers that work with you. I know a lot of treatment centers that say, hey, we got this. And then 30, 60, 90 days later, they say, good luck. And that to me is not ethical kind of practice. So be on the lookout for the ethics that you bring, and then the ethics of the organizations and professionals that you work with.
Great points. And I think getting out in front of kind of the history there of intervention being unregulated or really unlicensed with some certifications and which I've only found to benefit me when I'm going interstate. That's probably the only thing. Like I'm a therapist in Florida, but outside of Florida, it doesn't matter, in coaching to that end. But I do think it is, interventionist is really a meeting with a family in that's really vulnerable and really scared about their loved one, and we have to be held to a high standard of ethics and best practices. But again, I like what you're saying, that building throughout the treatment continuum or the continuum of care for that client or the family, that we want to make sure that the places we refer to us, that they're going to get good treatment. And I always say that when I meet a new treatment center, I say, I'm interviewing you and you're interviewing me, because that I can't tell until we see what happens in the front end, during treatment, and post-treatment. So I think that's the best type of marketing I've seen. Jeff, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I did. This is sort of a COVID note, which
great
is sort of an aspect of our practice right now in terms of treatment planning. The usual plan obviously is we're not looking for a 30-day fix, even if a family is, even if your loved one, if that's all they say they can give, you try to create more of a space so there's a continuum of care. But we have to keep in mind right now that intensive outpatient or PHP, partial hospitalization, which will be your next step down from residential, is often not an option unless it's virtual. Mm-hmm. So that doesn't mean that you skip it. It's just that there are some good programs. If you know your treatment and you're working with your colleagues collaboratively to find a program that's going to be able to continue to meet that client, meet with them live with good COVID protocols, et cetera. For me, being in LA, that's been a real consideration because, you know, especially when a client is returning to their using environment on a laptop, meaning home, condo paid for by parents, et cetera, which is sort of the adjunct of the man-child living at home until whenever. Got to be really careful that they're not returning to a slippery place. You can find a really good structured sober living that hopefully is active and able to get people out, notwithstanding the fact that you have some limitations on movement right now.
Great point too on COVID.
Well, and I want to make sure that the client's able to continue with that care to the extent possible. I don't like them having to go from one team to the next when they've established trust and so forth. But going in, you want to pick a team that's able to continue to meet that client and is, you know, at least having a hybrided model so that even if some of it is going to be virtual, there are many good programs that are meeting live with that client. And it's always, I feel, going to be preferable to continue that trust bond that's building, right? And to make sure that they have as rich and continuous process as possible.
Absolutely. Dr. Stenger?
So I just wanted for the clinicians out there, like, or for them to know that when we do work with another treatment center, our goal is to be able to have not just bring someone to a treatment center, but get a progress only consent form signed. Because in that way, we advocate for both the family and the identified loved one. And we also run ripshop because sometimes families can be sort of anxious, let's put it that way, with treatment centers. And that, you know, when you think about treatment, when you talked about treatment planning, I like to say that what we're really engaged in is care management. We want to build scaffolding, which is beyond any residential treatment center life, as Jeffrey was talking about. It is one thing to go into a residential treatment center. It's quite another thing. What happens when we know that real recovery starts when treatment ends? And do we need to put in sober link? Do we need to put in a recovery coach? Do we need to put in a live-in counselor? Do we offer structured sober living? I mean, that is really critical part. And, you know, when you're able to work hand in hand with the professionals at the center, and honestly, I wouldn't really work with anyone who wouldn't be willing to do that. And, you know, that's just sort of a rule of thumb. And being able to always vet centers, because people come and go, you know, who was the great staff there may change, or treatment centers get bought, or, you know, there's all these different things. So you really have to be on top of your game to that. And you can be of service to those clinicians in your community because they may not know where something is. And then for the clinician that's working, I think it's really important for interventionists to say, if you're getting a clinician referral, yeah, we'll work alongside of you. We're not trying to replace you. And oftentimes you might end up with, you know, someone going to treatment and they're from Chicago, but their therapist is there. So they're also on that progress only consent form. Just some little nuts and bolts kinds of
Absolutely.
things.
And I think to that end, in the assessment process, like that information, the collateral from the referring therapist or clinician is really invaluable most of the time. And before we move to the next slide, and I will touch on when not to do an intervention, but I was thinking insofar as COVID is concerned and the impacts of many things in this particular to treatment. And Caroline, maybe you can speak to this, because we'll all agree that family programs, and that's where my heart is working with family systems in treatment centers, that became impossible for, I would think, most treatment centers for a very long time to even bring a family in. And what workarounds you found in the treatment planning process, and maybe talk just briefly about some of the intensive you've done that we've talked about that I think were an amazing workaround for some family systems that were able to do it.
Yeah, COVID's changed a lot. I don't even have to say it. You guys all know it. The stress collectively, globally, has really impacted a lot. We're becoming much more stressed and much more unhappy as Americans. The CDC says that depression is the leading cause of workplace disability, and stress is the #1 reason that people see a primary physician. So one thing, I worked for a very large hospital, and all the protocols were in place, but one thing that I was able to do is travel to the family and provide that service so they didn't have to travel. Children and teens, like Dr. Louise said, are really showing up in crisis. Much more, it's just progressive. I think COVID exacerbated that, but that wasn't, it's been advancing. And, kids are seeing porn now. The average age is 10. And it really is skewing their arousal template. And if you're a clinician or a professional in this industry, I don't want you to close your eyes to this. This is not a moral issue of if porn is okay or not. This is premature exposure that's really harming. And if you want to see the stats, America uses way more porn than any other country. And last year, Mississippians spent more time. All the states that have the highest porn use are in the South for some reason. But there's a wonderful resource called culturereframed.org. It's a not-for-profit. It is a fantastic resource, especially for parents to have those conversations with their kids. Going back to, we're not happy as a society. And so, subconsciously, our brain is going to push us to find relief, and that does impact our, self-defeating behaviors, addiction. There are more suicides right now in America than homicides. People are just really struggling to find resources and to find hope. But one of the problems is that chronic stress, of course, is the enemy of long-term sobriety. And we have to have achieved some sobriety before we can engage in recovery. And I define recovery literally as reclaiming that which has been lost or stolen. And people with addictive family systems have lost sight of their authentic selves in many ways. So the other issue I think that is impacting children, I did a presentation because we've had a lot of child suicides in this area. And I found that in America, the average time that a parent spends with their child on untask related time is 16 minutes a day. And so kids are feeling very alone, very isolated. And if we don't have that secure bond or that, that tribe basically that we feel we belong to, our survival brain kicks in. I read something kind of funny the other day that said, relationships are so important to our health that it's better to eat a Twinkie with friends than broccoli alone. I don't know if that's true, but I thought it was kind of interesting.
I love it. I love it. It's probably true. I mean, but to that end, I think, you really have shined a light on the fact that, people are struggling, and certainly, a lot of treatment centers I talk to are full, and everybody's busy, which is a good thing, but it really does. I think a lot of us have great jobs that we'd actually find something else to do, and it would be okay if we were put out of business. But unfortunately, people are really, struggling. And so I think looking at that comprehensively throughout different, age groups is really important. So maybe to move to the next slide, Ashley, I do want to just talk briefly some of the things we have covered on like safety concerns. So obviously we assess for acute withdrawal symptoms and make sure that we're placing people along the ASAM levels of care, and then making sure that we have, a team that is going to, help itself and work together. I want to make sure that everybody's safe. And And I think we all have our own assessment processes for that. I've had the experience where I get a call for an intervention and it's really someone with a persistent mental health issue and it's a crisis stabilization call. I think that's something we all agree on, that there's an acuity level that it's not an intervention. I think we've all probably referred out multiple calls like that. And I think ethically speaking, it's probably the one thing I'm most protective of as it pertains to, good, ethical operator interventionists, is we don't take calls that we shouldn't be taking. We don't take those cases. And I hate to hear when that happens, when someone's in psychosis and a surprise intervention is being planned. And I will often tell the person, this is not the same call that, and I think we all probably spend or have spent a lot of time with those families, just trying to get them to the right resources. I think Ryan, who was on earlier for Ryan Chu, he and I have referred back and forth. I've sent him lots of people, and often we're trying to find the right treatment center, the right clinician for that particular case, which a lot of times is not me, it's not him, it's not us, and really being advocates for, recovery and substance use and mental health. I'm going to try to put the gas pedal down because I've invariably not driven the train as fast as I should have, or kept us on track. But I just thought maybe we could talk about a couple things, maybe particular to each one of you, on either how you've seen intervention change or things you're passionate about that are emergent trends, or I know that Jeff wants to speak to alternative sentencing, and maybe Eric, you could talk about case management a little bit, but maybe just a couple minutes on that, and then hopefully we'll get a question or two in from the audience, who I am so sorry to everybody ahead of time that there's not going to be a tremendous amount of time for questions. But Jeff, you want to start us off?
Sure. Care advocacy is really close to my heart because, whether it's as an attorney representing someone with a criminal case, sometimes we're talking about a professional who has a licensing board entanglement. It's a little like what Caroline was saying earlier about having motivation be really high for change across a family system. There's nothing like a legal crisis to sort of help a family understand, that, they may be at bottom, and that's a great place to start. If they can't or won't do it this way anymore, they don't need to wait for the next DUI, or as Eric was saying earlier, the whole car to break down. The courts are managing for their loved one what the loved one can't manage for themselves. And yet a legal crisis is just a reflection of a larger family and individual crisis in terms of their mental health, often substance driven as well. And especially with psychosis, it's interesting. The LA County Jail now has the highest population of mental health individuals in the world, and it's a jail. So that's not treatment, that's jail. And they attribute a lot of that to what became a drug in my journey of addiction, which is methamphetamine, because it will produce psychosis. Even to a seasoned psychiatrist, you can't tell the difference between drug-induced psychosis and that which is occurring because of a psychotic or schizophrenic break. And so what you do have, though, motivationally speaking, is this hot minute where for many of my clients, I describe it as a minor inconvenience, being in custody, not just once, but maybe 3 or 4 times, and we're at a point where they're being lost to a system that is geared towards punishment over treatment. And yet you do have prosecutors today in drug courts and DUI courts, mental health courts. There's actually this misconception that they're just out to punish the problem away. They're actually looking for a turnkey solution that we provide. And so a treatment plan, it's really interesting what happens motivationally for the same guy or gal who says they will never go to treatment. Almost no questions other than when am I getting out to go to treatment when they're in custody. And yet what we do have too is this tendency, as I said before, to sort of be like, okay, let's wait for release. They also will get bad information like, hey, maybe they need to be in jail. That might be true for some, especially if there's like really antisocial, or you have someone so addicted that they're just going to hurt themselves or someone else. So we have to find that middle ground between letting them languish. It's not like there's a learning curve where, they're coming to great moments of truth in custody. If anything, their addict thinking and their mental health is getting worse. They're in a criminal population. And yet you're going to have to help that family manage their fear, because the greatest fear for a codependent are consequences. And this is huge because they've actually started to have them. And they're starting to now, if they have an opportunity to get out. Sadly, I have a client who went from minor nonviolent drug offenses, left over 10, maybe 12 treatment programs on AMA. It had the drug addicted boyfriend, trauma on trauma. She graduated to an armed robbery and will not have that chance for probably over 10 years. And yet families sometimes will wait, you know, sometimes families need to see it get worse, but our job is actually to elevate that conversation and explain all that's really required for successful intervention right now is that you have had enough, and that you are actually going to channel your help in a direction that is truly helping, and be able to withstand and honor that. That's really scary for any parent, any spouse, to have their loved one especially in time of COVID, right? In custody with a dangerous population. And often we're having to explain they are safer in jail. And what a horrible place for a parent to be actually able to sleep better, knowing their child is in jail, right? And so, as I said before, too, working collaboratively to work with that attorney, often working with, it's also a misconception that public defenders are bad attorneys. They're actually amazing. They try a lot of cases. They're not great with the treatment piece, especially if we're talking out of county or we're talking something more nuanced or dual diagnosis out of area. But our job is, as interventionists as well, is to be care advocates. And sometimes that's the healthy way to engage. So a parent is not really engaging to get counsel to decide whether someone was robbed. You know, they were typically. Right? My clients typically aren't ones that are at like 0.08 BAC. If they are, they're probably on heroin and it's not their car, right? So you have to be able to help them understand that, yeah, we're not going to leave them there, but let's have the intervention discussion. Often it's an attorney consult, and I'll meet with a client and be able to actually know my limitations. I don't want to engage and be part of the problem with the wishful thinking maybe as a younger lawyer I would engage with, because that client becomes your client. It's not the family at that point. And if they don't want to go to treatment and they just want to continue shucking and jiving as they do and want to just avoid the consequence, then that's your role. So I'd rather have this conversation, say, hey, I'm really good at my game. I'm a specialist at this. Your family and health can't help you unless you're helping yourself. This is how I want to help you. But to be honest, if you're not going to create defenses and change this narrative, then you're just going to have to tell it to the jury, tell it to the public defender, you know, but we're not going to be able to be a part of that process in health. And often we get the horse trading so that you can in health engage at that point because you have someone who's actually on board for his own care. And then again, without wishful thinking, you want to structure a release to treatment that has the proper bond considerations, that has structure and an ability to return them to custody, so we don't have this space that I hate seeing families in, which is they bond someone out with the best of intentions, all of these great promises, and yet heroin addiction is stronger than their promises. And you need to be able to have a conversation like this, saying, I don't want you to go back to custody. It's a really bad look for you to jump basically your own bond. You won't get out. You won't get this opportunity. Can you find a way to stay? How can we find a way to stay when your addiction's pulling you out? You know?
And what a great inroad, you know, it's nobody wants to end up in the legal system, but to kind of to meld those and really in the best interest of the client. I think it's fantastic. We have the Marchman Act here, and a lot of times I've seen it really save people's lives if used correctly. And I agree that I've seen judges that are amazing in trying to really help this person and not punish or the problem away, because I think most of us agree that hasn't worked. But just to shoot over to Eric, because I would like you to speak, if you could, just about your experience with case management as an emergent trend, and certainly you have some really great experience there with the 5-year plan and what have you. Can you maybe just give us a snapshot of that?
Sure, and I'll keep it brief. I speak fast, so hopefully I'll be able to do this. You know, it ties directly into, it's a nice segue from what Jeff was saying, because those high licensed professional programs and the drug court programs have set a template for what is successful. What are the components that put into place and held accountable to will produce better results at long-term recovery? And we see that time and time again with the doctor diversion program, the airline pilots program. The more specific the program is, the longer the accountability, the rate of, we'll use an objective measure of sobriety goes up. So pilots who spend time in a 10-year monitoring program after an airline infraction, and their license is on the line, 92% after 10 years are still sober. Mm-hmm. So that doesn't speak to the quality of their recovery, but what it does speak is that sobriety is possible. And what we found is that by taking the insurance restrictions and taking the myopic and old-time view that a lot of public has, that, oh my God, if they're like Sandra Bullock and they go to 30 days of treatment, they're going to get better, right? We know that 30 days of treatment does not work. And it's not that treatment is ineffective, it's that the time is ineffective. So case management to me is there's intervention, which happens in every family system, whether it's a formal intervention or not. Someone feels enough discomfort, they enter the recovery process. There's treatment, right duration for right intensity, over the right amount of time. And then there's everything after, right? So our motto is be clear, it's a year. There's going to be a year of a program of accountability that has multiple components tailored to you that are effective for your recovery. Doesn't have to be AA. I'm not talking AA. I'm talking about peer recovery. I'm talking about psychiatric. I'm talking about medication management. I'm talking about therapy. I'm talking about passion. What does someone love to do? Education, vocation, family relationships. All of those components get put into a plan, and there's accountability to that plan. There's monitoring, UDS testing if necessary. And that is where real recovery is going to take root. And if we can change the narrative that, hey, you go to treatment and you're better, to, hey, you have a year of a treatment plan that we're putting together for you. And if everyone starts speaking that language, we're going to see the effectiveness of all of those evidence-based interventions, the MI, the solution-focused therapy, the CBT, the DBT, the ACT, all of those are going to work to support that process and produce the outcomes that we're really looking for.
That was great. You didn't talk too fast either. I thought that was succinct, and I think we all buy into long-term, services, an immediate approach, and really getting the biopsychosocial, spiritual components of a person need to be addressed, and a system in place. So we've got just a couple minutes. Ashley, do you want to go to the last slide? I think it's a COVID. We're just gonna, certainly we're looking, when I'm placing clients, the first call is, how are you taking clients? Do they need a PCR test? Can they isolate people? I think now it's a lot, everybody's kind of worked out their systems. But it was really difficult, certainly with any surprise interventions or really quick timelines, it just would rule out places. So I think everybody's dealing with that one way or the other, but I don't have enough time to address that. I would like to give everybody just maybe a quick parting thought on maybe anything you would want to leave the audience with about, your role as an interventionist, as a clinician, as, just as a treatment and recovery advocate. Maybe Dr. Stanger, you want to take us out first and just tell us something, leave us with some good words or parting words?
Well, I guess, I don't know if there's any questions, but for me, there's always hope and there's always a solution. And there's so many good people out there today in the field that if you don't know, pick up the phone. I mean, I know I still answer my own phone. And for me, I'm interested in legacy at this stage. I don't think I ever want to stop, but I am mindful that I'm going to be 75 this year. And for me, the greatest gift that I can see is the people in the field today who are like yourself, David, Eric, Carolyn, Ken, and all the people who are creating a field that's meaningful, that people have good education, there's 2 different intervention groups. Maybe someday they'll join. There's NII and AIS, and that, the Pennsylvania Certification Board will really increase its educational offerings. So for me, my goal, my passion is helping families thrive. And I am just that little tiny dot along the way. And, my philosophy was, if you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. So the greatest gift that I can get, or I think that anybody that I work with can give, is for our clients to far surpass us, for them to rise to their best possible selves and know that we're just that little tiny cog, but the skill we have is really great and really mighty. And that I probably speak for everyone on this panel, that each one of us would pick up their phone to answer your questions, because at the heart of this is we want you to become the best possible version of yourself, to use interventionists in an appropriate manner, and to really recognize what good treatment is and what good clinical, and I call it care management, the scaffolding is needed to help families thrive. So thank you. I learned so much from everybody that was here. Carolyn, I've never heard you before. It was such an honor to hear you. Eric, I just loved the way you spoke. And Jeffrey, it's been a while and you always inspire me. So David, thank you.
Likewise. And real quick, I know that Eric's got to head out right at 11 his time, but if y'all, if anybody else could stay maybe for 5 or 10 more minutes, if you have it, to answer any questions, because I'm sure there might be a couple. Are you available, Dr. Louise, for a couple minutes?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
And and I know, Eric, if you need to go, I totally understand. If you just want to give us your parting words there.
Yeah, well, thank you everyone on the panel. I feel like I'm with esteemed colleagues who think like I do, and that's really kind of what I strive to find as we work with these challenging populations and challenging families. And if you're interested in interventions, I'm going to do a little bit of a plug here. We do offer some trainings, and our trainings, I encourage you to do every training you can. There are a lot of people who do great trainings across the country, so it doesn't have to be ours. But if you are interested, learn. It's not I was intervened on and 30 days later I can be an interventionist. There is some having that kind of personal experience can be valuable, but there's a lot of that goes into being an interventionist beyond just, hey, let's get this person to treatment. And I hope that message came through to you all. And thank you so much, Dave. Always a pleasure. Wish me luck. We're going into a challenging case conference right now. So
good luck.
You've got this. You've got this.
Yeah, go get them. Yeah.
Bye, everyone.
Great.
Bye.
Thank you. And maybe can the 4 of you hang on for just a couple minutes? Great, because I know there's some questions from the crowd, and maybe we'll get your parting thoughts at the end there. But there we go. I know there were some. How are we doing this, Ashley? Are they gonna text them into the chat?
Yeah, so I just took off the screen share just because it said
Perfect.
just the questions. But yeah, anybody who has a question can either put it in the chat or they can put it in the question and answer on the bottom of your screen, and we can read it out loud.
Great. And I will send out the PowerPoints to everybody, Ashley, and include some resources or some specific material that we've talked about, more kind of a comprehensive snapshot, because it was a lot of information and fantastic. Let's see.
David, if you want to share that private YouTube that has a lot more information on attachment, I'm happy for you to do that.
Great. I have a colleague who had reached out to me. She was very interested in attachment theory and working with it. And so Dr. Bryce Hagedorn, who was my addictions professor at the University of Central Florida, go Knights, he has put in the chat, you have mentioned this, but has anyone experienced personal impacts, i.e. wellness related to conducting interventions? So experience personal impacts like in your own personal wellness, as I understand that. I take it to mean burnout, or I think that's what he would mean. So how has that experience been for you in maintaining your own personal wellness as a clinician or an interventionist?
Oh, I love that question. First of all, I do still consult with someone who I think is absolutely genius, both in terms of Gaetano Becerra, who has run programs, both as a therapist and having a team, we always process. Afterwards, what was right, what was wrong, what could we do better? But I think you have to take time for yourself. I mean, when you do this, this is so high intensity. You know, you are, I guess, I'm not really a sports person, but you know, the pitcher and the catcher. When that pitcher is throwing to that catcher, there may be screaming noise all over the place, but the only thing you see is that ball. And when you are doing interventions, you have to be 150% focused on that. And you come off and there is excitement, there is drama. I'm not going to say there isn't, but then you also have to come down and take care of yourself. So however you do that, whether you start the morning with mindful meditation, whether you do journaling, whether you talk, whether you go out with your partner, I mean, to give a little plug for that book I just wrote, it's been #1 a couple times on Amazon. I don't get residuals, and it's called Addiction in the Family, but at the end of every chapter, there's self-care. Because if we don't do self-care, then we're not going to be able to do this work. And so think about what makes you smile, what makes you laugh, and make sure that you find time for your own family.
And I know the counselor ed students at the University of Central Florida, we were trained over and over to have wellness plans and look to offset burnout. And you're right, the intensity is and the fulfilling work of intervention or therapy, you know, it can be that, but there is a vacuum sometimes of like all those feelings, right? And I think we all can hold, like when I'm working with a family, like especially when we're about to get to some point, you know, it's palpable anxiety in the room, you know, and we have the benefit of not being emotionally involved, but doesn't mean we don't feel it. So I think a great question there. Would anybody else like to speak to wellness practices or anything like that?
Well, we truly do need each other. You know, I like the quote, when it's all said and done, we're just walking each other home. But to have relationships where we feel like we're accepted and we belong, it's imperative, it's essential for our wellness. And that's why I love the 12-step fellowships. I mean, that's the ultimate attachment repair group. It's affordable and portable, and we're seen and we're safe. And, you know, I think burnout, it happens and it's not a quick fix. You know, you just don't get more sleep over the weekend and you're done with burnout. And it can really ruin a career. It can cause us to make decisions that we normally wouldn't make if we weren't in that burned out state. So I think self-care is how we get our power back. It's how we, you know, to know what brings us alive and to incorporate that, to know what drains us and to be mindful of that. I think it's very important to stay professional. You know, as part of being a professional is to treat ourselves with such care. You know, it's very incongruent if I'm not doing self-care and I'm trying to tell my clients to do self-care. That doesn't feel good.
100%. Jeff, you want to speak to that?
You know, I think an aspect of every intervention I do is being willing to be vulnerable and share with them if they're interested. Not everyone's interested in our story, and it's not really about it, but I think it's just as important to often have, you know, be able to reveal really what my pain was like, what it was to walk in that darkness. And the flip side of that, especially having spent a lot of years in active addiction, I was the dope lawyer with the dope problem, cliche at one time, and I'm glad I survived that. But sometimes there's this invitation to hide behind the fact that I have the education or the experience, or, you know, myself as a lawyer. That's horrible energy for an intervention. Bring your lawyer, right? But you know, what I do find is sometimes, you know, I actually, my recovery benefits from it every time I can be brave enough to look at myself as a part of my disease. right? And be able to identify as a survivor and have pride and have strength in that, rather than the prior shame that I walked in and that darkness. And every bit as much as our job is to put a light forward, sometimes just be able to say, hey, I don't pretend to get everything going on with you, but I have had this darkness. You know, I have had a needle in my arm. I had to explain to a young woman who was overdosing a lot. Her drug of choice is fentanyl, no veins left. This idea that no one understands me. You know, it's a fine line. You don't want to act like just because you've walked in, you know, similar darkness that you understand theirs, but you have to show curiosity and you have to show a willingness to hold vigil to their pain, right? And be able to explain to them that, well, they are not their problem. They do have a problem and it's killing them, you know? And I love that moment when it might be hard for them to see me that way. But if I stop seeing myself that way, I'm of less usefulness to the alcoholic who's suffering, or the person in their mental health who is suffering, you know, and to be able to actually show a good model that, hey, this is how we come back. You know, this is what 15 years tomorrow of recovery looks like, and be able to have that be the pride and replacement of the shame. And then to the points you all made before, self-care, I just let the people who love me understand I'm going to be a little messy and complicated for a couple of days after going that deep, you know, and it's okay, because I've been in sort of dancing with the devil for a few days where I'm actually talking to people who are on the drug that used to run my life, right? I'm able to do that, knowing that the other option is to share less, be less vulnerable, and I'm less powerful that way, you know? So give yourself a wide berth is my best advice to the question is, you know, self-care. There's a great quote by, I think it's Buddha or Facebook. And it's, compassion that does not include self is incomplete. So if I'm going to talk about the importance of compassion, right, and help a mom who's bleeding out in regards to her adult son who's not taking care of herself, I have to be willing, as Caroline said, I have to be willing to give myself that compassion and be like, hey, this can be gnarly, right? This can be heartbreaking, you know? This is sometimes to be able to show up for a mom. I've had to do this, as all of you probably have this year, more than ever. I've had to talk to a parent who's lost their child to an overdose, and being willing to pick up that phone when you would love it to go to voicemail because you don't know what there is to say. But our role is not to fix. Our role is actually to be able to hold vigil to the pain of others and their suffering, and be able to inspire them to walk through that and understand it's going to be okay. It may not look the way that they think it's going to, but to be able to say, hey, you will get through this. I know it's going to be really, really hard, you know, but that's kind of the beauty of what we get to do. Rather than sort of dim that light, turn it down, I think it has to be really, really bright. And to do that, we have to exercise self-care, because when my tank is low, I'm not good for my bird.
Well, I think that's probably
my parrot, I mean. I'm
yeah.
not speaking in metaphor. I have a parrot, Sophie.
I think it's a great place to end, you know, that it's an intimate thing, right? To work with a family who's bringing you a life and death situation they don't know how to solve. And we are tools, you know, as people, whether it's Ryan, who is facilitating entry to the right place, the right time in treatment, or it's, you know, in a jail visiting room with a lawyer, or in an intensive at Pine Grove, or, you know, in Dr. Stanger's work in her office, or what have you, is we are showing up, you know, at people who are desperate, and it is an intimate, I think we all probably are grateful to be able to serve in that capacity. But like you say, you know, it's the you have to put your mask on before you put it on the mask of the child in the plane when it loses, you know, cabin pressure. That without self-care, we couldn't do our jobs. We would all be impaired one way or the other. So I think it's a great place to end here. And I cannot thank you all enough. This was great. And I will, if any other questions come up at any point, Ryan or Ashley, I'll get answers to them. I didn't see any more, but Ryan, do you want to take us out?
Yeah, just wanted to say thank you so much, David, Caroline, Jeffrey, Dr. Stanger. It was a real pleasure, lots of valuable information. Also want to thank everybody for joining us today, and I appreciate you and hope you have a great weekend.